Good afternoon. Money enables and fuels illicit networks. Disrupting the financial infrastructure of these networks and targeting the money flows is a tool to stop the aims and goals of these networks. With us today, we have three renowned experts. Phil Rosenberg from Deloitte Financial Advisory Services. Phil, for 4 decades, has been a financial intelligence expert and world-renowned. Welcome, Phil. Jeff Ross, Senior Vice President of Green Dot Corporation and Bank, a 2-decade-long Justice Department and Treasury official with anti-money laundering expertise. Jeff, welcome. And Anthony DeChellis, in charge and head of Credit Suisse's America's private banking sector. Tony, thank you. Drug trafficking organizations, counterfeiting rings, human trafficking networks, terrorist organizations rely on money. It enables them to profit, to extend their reach and influence. It gives life to their goals. These gentlemen have spent a lifetime thinking about disrupting those networks. Money enables them, these networks. It also binds them. Whether organizations are small or large, organic or hierarchical, ideologically driven or profit-driven, money is the lifeblood. It's also the Achilles heel, because financial trails don't lie. And disrupting the financial infrastructure of these networks allows not just governments, but the private sector to disable their reach and their influence. And so I'm very pleased to be here today. It's an honor for me to be here. I want to thank Jared, Eric, Scott for inviting me to talk about these issues. So let's start. Phil, you've had deep experience in these issues. Talk to us about the evolution of illicit finance as you've seen it and some of the key vulnerabilities that you've seen for these illicit networks.
Thank you, Juan. Over the last 40 years, I've seen the people who are fighting today build the foundation of what they're doing on a tradition that was there before we were up against these bad guys. And that was the old age tradition of licit tax avoidance. And so financial centers were there in the world long before the drug traffickers and the cartels started. And there was a tradition of people licitly avoiding taxes. And so over time, as the bad guys started, first the narcotics traffickers, then the terrorists, the proliferators, organized crime, they took advantage of that tradition and that modus operandi that was out there. So you had, for example, if I put it in historical perspective, 1980, the Cayman Islands, millions of dollars flown in on Learjets belonging to the cartels, going back into the United States. The British and American government took action. It doesn't take place in the Caymans anymore. You move forward 12 years to 1992, the BCCI case in Europe, a major rogue financial institution based in Luxembourg with a beautiful building in London, set up for one reason, to move money illicitly for anyone. And you had all the bad guys converging and using BCCI for that purpose. Then you move forward to 2008, 2009, the Kabul bank case in Afghanistan. Same concept, an institution where narcotics traffickers, hawaladars that were supporting the Taliban and Al-Qaeda exploited that. I think the vulnerability that we need to focus on is the people in the middle, the facilitators. Through 40 years, I've seen accountants, bankers, lawyers, fiduciaries, corporate registration companies in these various centers that move in time. Today it's Cyprus, for example, is a hot place. And these people wittingly support and facilitate the clandestine movement of money and money laundering for the people we're trying to stop. And I think that's a tremendous vulnerability with modern technology and big data analytics.
And they're often all-purpose providers, right?
Right. You hit one of these facilitator groups on a particular offshore center. Go in for narcotics and you get terrorists and proliferators at the same time because the bad guys know where to go. Everyone knew about BCCI and they got channeled to it.
Tony, from your perspective, you're dealing with government regulations, Bank Secrecy Act requirements, reporting requirements of suspicious activity reports, having to ensure compliance. In many ways, the government, especially in the post-9/11 period, has put a heavy burden on big banks, banks like yours, to serve as the guardians at the gate of the financial system. Can you talk to us a little bit about your experience with that and how a bank like yours and others in the financial industry view keeping out illicit finance and how you deal with it?
Sure. So when I started in this business, which was in 1985, the concept of KYC, Know Your Client, really had a lot to do with that individual client's goals, needs, maybe their investment objectives, and that's still the case now. As financial complexity increased in the system, I think what parts of the government started to see, and also what we saw as our own responsibility, is a shift toward understanding not just those very fundamental things, but actually who the clients were in very, very deep detail. And so I think what we've seen over the last 25, 30 years is kind of an evolution where the financial institutions, I think, both understand and accept that we are kind of a key piece or the first guardians at the gate for the financial system. Now, we're not the enforcers, obviously, but we've got to be a huge piece. So knowing our clients to a very sort of deep extent is one of the things that I have seen. And the costs are obvious. If one of those bad actors, as I've heard them referred to here, gets through the system, then the cost to us is immeasurable. So the incentives, I think, are in the right place. I think the government's done a good job of putting those incentives in the right place. Probably can be modified somewhat on a go-forward basis. But we clearly have all the right incentives. Besides, there's the obvious thing of what is right and wrong, and I think we are obviously motivated by that. But it is, there is never going to be an upside if one of these folks get through the door. The real challenge for us, and I liken it sometimes to, airport security. We have every firm has sort of their own line, as opposed to all the airlines being on the other side, all the firms being on the other side. We all kind of have our own airport checkpoint. And I think one of the opportunities might be because the costs are just increasing, right? As complexity increases, as the complexity in the system increases, and frankly, as the bad actors become more and more clever. If we could somehow figure out a way to use that same checkpoint, become better, frankly, because we would harness our resources and be much more efficient. So that's a little bit how we're starting to think about it.
I think an important concept in this regard is the fact that reputation and integrity, particularly for big institutions, becomes the coin of the realm.
Yes.
And incredibly important. Today, before the Senate, we're seeing questions about HSBC, whether or not it violated money laundering rules, whether or not there were terrorist financing transactions happening through HSBC, a global institution, with potentially very heavy fines, reported over $1 billion. So as we speak, a bank is going through that process. Jeff, you've had many years of experience enforcing the laws. The money laundering laws, and then post 9/11, you helped the FBI establish their financial review group and deal with terrorist financing. Then you helped me at Treasury. Talk to us about the tools that we've traditionally used and whether or not they're sufficient, given what we're seeing in the 21st century.
Well, I think for this audience, it's important to recognize crime predicated on financial gain is ancient, right? Robin Hood, that sort of thing. And he gave to the poor, but then again, the poor were supporting him, so it was kind of promotion of his underlying activities. So we're playing catch-up here. All of us are playing catch-up. The idea of money laundering or terrorist financing as a separate, standalone, discrete criminal offense is new. It's relatively new. We've all talked about money laundering, but in fact, the first money laundering statute in the U.S. was not passed until 1986. Which made it a standalone offense. Prior to that in the U.S., there were laws that were looking at bulk cash movements, $10,000 deposits, $10,000 withdrawals, both in the financial institutions across borders and then at places like trades or businesses. But before 1970, the financing of underlying predicate criminal activity wasn't standalone. It was a part of a drug offense or as part of a fraud. So we're playing catch up. what's happened is the bad guys didn't have to play catch up. The bad guys understand what the financial tools were from day one. They've also watched as some of the things that Anthony talked about or Phyllis talked about have occurred, and as the government has pressed on certain tools, certain measures, countermeasures, they've adopted and adapted. And with the increasing globalization we're seeing in the movement of funds, as you just heard from the 5-minute presentation, 5 minutes. You're talking about millions moving through the e-commerce, through the internet. The tools that we have used historically were right and are still right for the types of simple money laundering. I'll call it simple, bulk cash movements across the border with Mexico, for instance. But in the longer scheme, the movements of funds, once the money's placed into the financial system, those tools are going to have to evolve. And we're going to have to be able to identify what the financial choke points are and go after those. We can't afford to go after every little case as a little case. We're going to have to look at it as a global phenomenon and develop tools that will help us attack it better.
Jeff, from your private sector perspective, you can just quickly talk about some of the evolutions of new capabilities and also products, things like prepaid cards, which we just heard about.
Very quickly, I don't want to bore you, but what brought me to Green Dot Corporation, we are a program manager and now an issuing bank for what are called prepaid debit cards. Raise your hand if you've heard of one. Not bad. When I talk to my cop friends, no hands go up. Basically, what our product is exactly synonymous to your bank debit card. So when you open up a bank account, right, you're given a bank debit card, your little picture and all that stuff. You can use that card because it's Visa branded or MasterCard branded. Anywhere in the world, you can make deposits, you can spend online, you can do it. Our card holders can do exactly the same. The functionality is identical with our products as far as our card holders are concerned to what you can do with your bank debit card. The difference is that whereas you walk into a brick and mortar bank, or more and more often you're going online to a financial institution such as Credit Suisse or UBS or Bank of America, in our case you actually get the application for the card at a retail merchant. So there are a lot more available. Now, as far as the Privacy Act goes and the Patriot Act, for instance, we collect the same type of information. You say, well, what happens to the funds put on the cards? As opposed to going directly to your personal bank account, they go to a pooled account that's held on behalf of all of the cardholders. So the funds are tagged to your account for FDIC purposes, but as you can see, it's a pretty far cry from opening up a traditional bank account. Very quickly, why I went to Green Dot was because I'd worked with the FBI and I saw that basically the 9/11 hijackers operated very transparently from a financial perspective. It was not hard to trace their movement. They came into the U.S., they opened bank accounts, they got ATM cards, we could trace them across the country. They actually received wires from the Hamburg group. Moussaoui brought money in, he filed a report on the money he brought in. A CTR was filed on Moussaoui. We are seeing the evolution of money, and the idea of opening a physical bank account with a physical ATM card and having to use wire transfers in and out are starting to move out of the picture.
Let's talk about that a bit, Phil, in terms of both your historical view and your current view of new trends as you see illicit networks evolve. You know, what's new and what's old? And especially as we talk about regulating in the formal financial system and as we see new products come online, what do you see as new and what do you see as a retread of old techniques?
I see the evolution of one of the techniques which was just starting, and that's to have control of a Class B bank when you have huge volumes of money. The bad guys still can't move millions of dollars via these new instruments. And so if I go back to the BCCI case, they had a secret bank in Switzerland which they controlled on top of their main institution. And so I think what they're doing now with these large-scale narcotics, organized crime, and proliferation networks, and some of the human trafficking linked to the same pattern, is that there are Class B, smaller banks, not the great institutions of the world, in these offshore centers and right here in the United States that the cartels control that we're not even aware of, because the person out front is the same person that's always been there. There were Swiss running the bank in Switzerland for BCCI. And I think that is a tremendous vulnerability, and those facilitators are out there, accountants, the bankers running that bank, lawyers and fiduciaries who know what they're doing. And I think now that technology has evolved where it is, what we're talking with Google about here today and Palantir, and true big data analytics in the cloud, you could pinpoint these things. We could preempt and prevent and spot them way ahead of the curve, because that bubble of money will show up in a place like Cyprus or Beirut. And then you can see the institution. There's more and more of these smaller banks that are in control of the bad guys.
Tony, we've talked about the responsibility of banks, and that's what you spend a lot of your time on. What about, and we've talked a little bit offline about this, sort of the notion of collective responsibility to not only protect the banking system, but also to ensure financial integrity globally? I mean, what are your thoughts about banks, non-bank financial institutions, and the responsibilities of the general international community to protect the financial system?
Yeah, it's interesting. Every time something happens, the first thing people want to know is who should have noticed, who should have figured it out. And my personal opinion is that there is a lot of information out there that is not being shared efficiently and effectively. And so I think it's everyone's, to answer your question, I think it's everyone's responsibility, I think, and meaning everyone, all the financial institutions and the government as well. Clearly, from a governance standpoint, from a compliance standpoint, the whole system has to rely on the financial institutions to ensure, that from the know your client information to the processes that we employ to work with clients. So I think that there's got to be an opportunity, and actually it's how I find myself here. Jared and I had a very interesting conversation about what role could technology play, because we find ourselves in the financial community as contributing a lot of information, sometimes informally to even competitor institutions, sometimes formally, but not really seeing maybe always the effects of that, or where does it really lead to. And so to me, it seems that there is an opportunity, because the bad actors are never going to give up. And it appears to me that they're using technology at least as well as the good guys are. And so I think we really need to start thinking about how we can sort of win this, in a united front. And now if you can ever include sort of a broader community outside that, yeah, that would be fantastic. I would be happy right now if we could take the collective intelligence of what various parts of the government know, what institutions know around the world, and somehow collect that. I think it'd be a great starting point.
Right. It reminds me of the debate that we heard this morning to start the conference about sort of old rules and old modalities that we're applying to ourselves, or at least the good guys are,
right.
Where the bad guys are innovating constantly, and the question of whether or not we have the right rules of the road to be able to disrupt properly. Phil, with that in mind, do we have the right notion of what financial intelligence is? Because historically we've thought about financial information as what banks give the government, or what's found in secret. Is that even appropriate in the 21st century?
I don't think so. I think you just take that term, following the money, and then you have it being defined as anti-money laundering, financial intelligence, counter-threat finance. And if you think of it, they can lie on the phone, but the money trail doesn't lie. That's what we've all talked about. And so, following on what Tony said, if we get very creative and innovative, which the technology now allows us to do, and we create a public-private partnership to share information first among the community of people trying to stop them, and then from the ground up, from the public, on the public side, there can be something in the open space, because throughout my career, every financial center I was in, the people there knew who these people were, and certainly in the community of the banks and the people in these financial centers, they knew long before the good guys knew who the bad actors and the bad banks were. So I think there's a dramatic opportunity for public-private partnership, keeping in mind all the appropriate legal, privacy issues, and risk issues in place to share information and be ahead of the bad guys and preempt them where they're operating today.
It's interesting you should say that, because I think in the context of human rights or catastrophes, you've seen private sector actors, NGOs, engage in not just data collection, but data analysis and projection. We've seen Google Earth and the Holocaust Museum do that in the context of some of the atrocities in Darfur. You haven't yet seen that evolution in the anti-money laundering, illicit finance space, so that's very interesting. Jeff, can you talk a little bit to us as well about mobile technologies? Because mobile banking has become incredibly important, and as we look at the developing world, in a very important way that people are moving money.
Yeah, no, I think it's a crucial element for all of us to be considering. And Eric in his presentation was speaking about the small village in an African nation. No bank accounts. Historically, no bank accounts whatsoever, or very few. And now you have the potential for each person in that village to have access to the global financial community through a smartphone. I mean, it's there and it's happening. And so, again, the question is, who controls the information about the financial movements that originate at a small village in Mali and then moves through a global bank, possibly a Credit Suisse, and then ends up getting consolidated and brought into the United States? Where are those modalities? Where do the choke points for those funds exist? And when you concentrate on those, it really makes no difference whether the funds are originating from a smartphone in Mali or whether they're originating from a Casa de Cambio in Mexico or originating from, my bank account at Justice Credit Union. Because what you're doing is identifying the key points that control the movements of the funds. And as technology evolves, it is absolutely essential that the industry, both Googles of the world and the financial providers, whether they're Credit Suisses or Bank of America's or Green Dot or Western Union, look at what the new enhanced potentials are for funds to move over and through their networks, and to work with the government and to work with their regulators to identify the weak points in the, I keep using it, but it's my favorite term, choke points, that together we can identify, so that even though it sounds super sexy, oh, it's smartphone, it's not that sexy. It's still funds entering the system here, moving through systems here, and coming out there. And you can identify those 3 points, then you can trace it.
Tony, this is an interesting point, the idea of financial choke points, which has obviously been a focus of security services, prosecutors, et cetera, but it also has implications for the big banks and the formal financial sector, because at the end of the day, the Casas de Cambio, the Hawaladars, the trusted broker system in South Asia and the Middle East, all converge back in a way, back into the banking system. So how do you, from your perspective, in terms of compliance and in terms of keeping bad actors out or tainted money out of your system, how do you think about that convergence and these choke points that Jeff was just talking about?
Yeah, I mean, it's a question that we think about a lot. I can't tell you we have all the answers right now, because I think our industry is actually pondering, currently what is going to be the impact of an increasingly mobile world, and as banking moves more and more, through the phones. And it'll be an interesting question actually for the telecommunications companies, who might find themselves being asked a lot of the same questions that the financial institutions are being asked about. Are you watching, the money that's basically moving through your system? And I don't know if we've really kept up with all of that yet, but we're certainly watching it. I think I go back to sort of the technology, question that Jared and I initially talked about, and it seems to me that if we're really going to be creating those choke points, there is an opportunity for technology to help us spot, because then the world becomes smaller, and there becomes fewer and fewer places, maybe for particularly cash or money, to move through the system. And I think one of the things we also all have to keep in mind as we talk about these things, From the banking side, we have clients who are enduring all of this. So when you think about these things you want to do, there are clients on the other side, and you have to try to make it also as efficient and as effective, for them. I can use the airport security line again.
Right.
We want to make that process as good as it possibly can be.
Well, that's an important idea. Just a quick question for you,
Yeah.
because the USA Patriot Act, Title III of which imposes a lot of additional requirements on financial institutions to do due diligence, know your customer, et cetera, also allows banks to share information between themselves. And so I think one question for institutions that are subject to regulation, as well as others, is how willing you are to share information between the private sector, because the paradigm has been
Sure.
from the private sector to governments. What about between institutions and between types of institutions?
Well, I can't speak for the other institutions. I can only imagine that their feeling might be similar to mine, which is, no one wants their firewalls breached and, for any reason to manipulate client data or to access that data. However, I think they'd probably have a similar view if you could contribute, information and to collaborate in that fashion. It's done now. There are ways, certainly, informally. There's some formal ways it's done, but phones are picked up. Phil and I had an interesting conversation about, a particular strategy that was being employed by some of the bad actors, and how basically, people got on the phone and talked to one another, but it wasn't efficient enough, because Phil told me about someone who could have used that information a little bit earlier, because then they ran into the same problem. So I think you'd find a willing, community, as long as the client, confidentiality was protected and not breached.
Phil, you talked about the facilitators, the lawyers, the accountants that are all-purpose providers. Can you talk a little bit about the convergence of illicit financial networks between groups? For example, we've seen Al-Qaeda or branches of Al-Qaeda engage in criminal activity, kidnapping for ransom, bank robberies. We've seen states like North Korea engage in counterfeiting of $100 bills, known as the super note, or engaging in cigarette smuggling. And so there's a blending of the types of groups and organizations that actually do this. Can you talk about how the financing links those together?
I think the most current example is right on our back door with Hezbollah and narcotics trafficking.
Talk to us about that.
In Latin America, and there's been a convergence that's great work of DEA and others to uncover Hezbollah as a criminal enterprise engaged in narcotics trafficking, trade-based money laundering with cars, and converging right on our back doorstep in Latin America with that kind of activity. And that's a growing trend of convergence of criminal business activity to raise money between cartels and a terrorist organization. The other thing that's striking to me, and is a vulnerability besides these facilitators in the middle, is I've seen Russian organized crime up and close throughout my career, and they would be number one and the cartels number two in doing this. But another vulnerability is, besides the facilitators in the middle, I've seen the mastermind every time. People have to remember that Meyer Lansky was a real person working for the mob in Chicago. Osama bin Laden had Sheikh Zayed.
The Egyptian accountant.
Right, who you and I remember after 9/11 was running the money for Zawahiri and bin Laden, and was intelligent enough, switching from the euro into gold and managing the money. And while there can be shells throughout the world of these organizations, hundreds of them, there's that mastermind behind it too. It's not 20 masterminds, it's one person. So if there's somebody behind that nexus convergence of, for example, Hezbollah with narcotics and trade-based money laundering and criminal activity, there's a financial mastermind there doing that too. And that's a tremendous vulnerability. That person is in control, even though the network seems very complex.
Jeff, one argument we've seen in the enforcement community is that the more organizations, terrorists or organized crime or cartels, engage in classic criminal activity, the more vulnerable they are, because countries and governments know how to deal with that. Terrorist financing in some ways is a little bit more difficult to handle, has some political connotations, but if somebody's engaged in drug trafficking or counterfeiting, it's a little bit more subject to classic tools. Can you give us some examples of how you see that and how these organizations have used crime to their benefit?
Sure. Juan, I'll give you a good one that I actually got to work on. There was a gentleman asking a question who was from Mexico. And when I was at both Justice and Treasury, a key area that we were focusing on, even after 9/11, even when we were looking at terrorist financing, was literally the billions of dollars, billions, anywhere from 10 to 20 billion dollars that illicitly was crossing the U.S. border into Mexico. And the question was, what do we do? This is the vulnerability. Money weighs a lot. If you're talking about $20 billion in 5, 10s, 20s, 50s, and if they could get them hundreds, which was a good point for us to look at, conversion of small bills to hundreds, how do we target the money? We don't want to target on an individual case. We want to look at it holistically. So what you do is you try to identify the currency flows coming back from Mexico to the United States, and then you identify who in the U.S. are the gatekeepers for those currency flows, which are the 3 or 4 or 5 or whatever banks in the U.S., because they're on our side of the border. We had the best shot at working with them to identify those funds coming back and to try to disrupt, which is the topic of what we're talking about. How do you disrupt the flow of the funds back? So you use a variety of levers. You work with the foreign government. You try to get Mexico to pass stiffer money laundering laws that put real teeth in the registration and licensing of Casa de Cambios, which were pretty much Wild West in the late 90s. You put pressure, nicely, on the U.S. banks to say, you're getting $5 billion a year in money, cash, coming back from Mexico. How's that possible? How's it possible? The tourists aren't taking that money down there. So where's all this cash coming from? And don't tell me it's the day laborer, who goes back and visits his grandmother. I don't believe it. And you put out advisories. FinCEN put an advisory out from the Treasury Department specifically describing how this money was moving into Mexico and through the Casas and back to the United States. And this is what you do, Juan. You identify a weakness, a financial weakness for these people, and then you go after that and you try to disrupt it. And what would happen if you're successful? So I used to be asked, what's your measure of success? My measure of success was if instead of seeing the money coming back from Mexico, we started seeing it come back from Guatemala or Honduras. If we pushed it somewhere else, and then you start to look and see what the divergence of funds are. Drug money laundering is an easier target because of the bulk and the weight of the currency itself. It's a much more difficult target when the funds have already been placed into the financial system, and it's just a matter of them layering through various financial facilities, whether it's a Green Dot or a Credit Suisse, to get to its ultimate destination. One thing we did look for were hubs and spokes, because one really good thing about money laundering investigations is if you find a spoke and it goes back to a hub, then you've probably identified 50 other spokes coming off of it. And each of those spokes could be a separate investigation, which again is why using financial investigations to disrupt multiple activities engaged in possibly by a single or maybe multiple criminal enterprises is, I think, one of the most effective ways to go after them.
Tony, we heard Eric Schmidt talking a little bit about name and shame. And at the Treasury, we often use the tool of designations, public designations, to freeze bank accounts, but to notify the financial community about a nefarious actor, a terrorist financier, a drug kingpin. Talk to us a little bit about your view as to legitimacy and the role of legitimacy as a tool for the financial community, but also those trying to disrupt the flows of illicit capital.
Legitimacy from the standpoint of how the sort of the bad actors want to use, you mean a firm like
That's right.
Suisse?
Maybe I can clarify. In part, the very essence of money laundering is the attempt to clean dirty money and make it appear legitimate. And those who are engaging in commercial activity, illicit networks, at some point want to appear legitimate or want to inject into the legitimate financial commercial world. How can we think about that as a tool?
Yeah, so, and obviously we understand that's why a lot of these bad actors want to find their way to one of the bigger name financial institutions, because it does sort of ease their path. Because there's an assumption that if it's coming from one of these places, there's been a very high level of, of due diligence. And that's why it is so important to know your customers, to know your clients, which, sounds really easy, but it can be quite complicated as the layering that was just sort of discussed. Or if, as Phil and I discussed yesterday, if legitimate entities are then taken over by, bad actors, what is the process to figure that out quickly? You'll probably eventually figure it out, but again, I come back to the collaboration. Probably together we would figure that out, quickly if there was a good collaboration role.
And I think one of the challenges, too, is these groups, these networks gain in power, are able to embed themselves with legitimacy and in legitimate systems, is how you disentangle that. I mean, we saw this when I was in government, the difficulty of putting in place measures where you excise the illicit activity in networks from the legitimate activity once they're embedded. So that's a very difficult problem. We just have a few minutes. I want to do kind of a bit of a lightning round, maybe ask you for a minute answer to this question. And we didn't prepare for this, so get ready. If you had your druthers, what tools or mechanisms would you have in place now that would allow the international community, the legitimate financial world, to disrupt illicit financial flows? I'm going to turn to you first, Phil.
My vision would be working with Google, Palantir, and others to create a Venn diagram of that sharing of information so that from the ground up, the person on the street could input on the public side, the central banks could share their data on money flows very openly that would show a particular center at a particular time is where they are now. On the other side, there would be this private exchange formalized between the financial services industry, central banks, and ministries of finance, not breaking anybody's privacy and just sharing information on what they're seeing now of a particular bad actor. Because you have to keep in mind, if you take, for example, what you started and has continued today with the Iranians, that's state-sponsored, and Jeff alluded to that. That isn't money laundering. That's money coming right out of the central bank into the major bank, like the Bank Melli, and action taken to cut them off for the nuclear program, and that's come a long way. And so my vision and my dream would be that kind of, with modern technology that's here and big data analytics, that sharing of information, the public side quite openly from the ground up, the private sector sharing it, and there's a place in between, a small space, where the governments and the private sector working together to take action, to really be proactive and go after these people.
Right. I think we would often be amazed as to how much information was available in the public sphere, what we call the open source,
right.
Just there. Jeff?
Yeah, no, I'm going to bounce off of that because everything was correct. I'm going to kind of divide it into two parts. You've got historical crime that's occurring through historical means, and bulk cash is one, wire transfer is another, black market peso out of Colombia, or trade-based money laundering out of the Middle East. And I think everything that Phil just said is right. That's where you need to converge the various people, the good guys, right? The good guys, to try to share as much information, to work together, to identify that this is what's being done and how it's being done, and then to work together. But I think there's a second part to this. And I think that to the extent that technology is improving, and to the extent that new payment methodologies, not new money, but new payment methodologies are being developed through e-commerce or through any other way, it is absolutely essential that this same collaboration occurs as early as possible, proactively to identify how a criminal could use those things. Because what you've got to do is, we call it in my company, I do a moot court on something new we're thinking about. How, if I were a bad guy, how would I use it? And then if you can identify those from the get-go, you can build systems. that will mine the data that's going to be flowing through whatever these new things are and better attack it.
Tony, you've got 10 seconds.
Okay.
I apologize.
Then I would support the idea that Phil proposed. And I'd probably just add to it that I think, and the two things go hand in hand, is making sure that more clearly defining everyone's responsibility in that sort of collective information to what you're trying to find, what you're trying to look for, and how you're going to basically collaborate with that database. And the last thing I would say is that I think there's also an opportunity for countries to more clearly define the information they're going to share with one another, whether that's G7, G20 to start with, 194 countries, if that's how many there are, would be a nice idea. But I think we have to start smaller, where we really, and maybe FATCA is a good roadmap for that. But I think a lot of this, we're talking about collaboration. I think it's also if countries started to collaborate more closely as well, and clearly identify the information they're going to share, as Phil said, appreciating the confidentiality laws of each country. I think there's a lot that can be accomplished. I think there's a lot you can do. And it's just, I view it as a natural evolution because the financial system is becoming increasingly more complex.
Right. Well, with that, we are done with our panel. I want to thank the panelists and would ask you to thank the panelists along with me. Thank you very much.